Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 199 and it's titled Mahalementals. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Jake over on Twitter, and that card is Maha, Its Feathers Knight. And Maha is 3 black for a 6/5 legendary creature elemental bird, has flying, trample, ward of discard a card, and creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. So, as is tradition on this channel, if we have a legendary creature as our suggested card, then of course it's got to be our commander. So, this week we are fully building around Maha, Its Feathers Knight. And before we get into some of the little pieces of this deck that make it work, I do just want to give everyone a huge shout out and a thank you for all of the support that you guys gave me during 2024. Hopefully this, as our first video in 2025, will live up to those expectations, and I am looking forward to a great year of great deck techs. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some of our themes and talk about what exactly makes this deck work. So, first up, we have Elementals. I decided when I started building this deck that I didn't want to go the traditional route of just giving everything -1/-1, killing stuff with Maha, drawing cards. It just kind of felt a little too expected in a way, so I wanted to add a little bit of a twist to it, my own personal twist, and that is Elementals. As you may know, I am a huge fan of kind of janky kindred types, and Elementals tend to see a lot of support in red and blue and green, but not so much in black. So there are an actual surprising amount of Elementals in black, and they all play really well with Maha. Because, for example, we have Grief, which is 2 black for a 3/2 elemental incarnation. It has Menace. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards a card. Then you can evoke it to exile a black card from your hand. And if it's evoked, that means that it will enter and immediately sacrifice itself, so you just get the enter the battlefield effect. Now, normally this is not a card you would play in Commander, but because Maha has that ward ability of discard a card, it's actually very important that we can keep our opponent's hand sizes to a minimum, because if they can't pay the ward cost, then they just can't get rid of Maha through anything other than a board wipe. With that being said though, there's not a ton of synergies between Elementals in mono black. They all kind of do the same things, but we don't have any Lord effects. We don't have anything that says all Elementals you control or anything like that. We are leaning pretty heavily into the artifacts that allow us to name a creature type. And of course, just the fact that there's actually some pretty solid mono black Elementals. That is, though, not our only theme. And I did mention that I didn't want to go all in on the -1/-1 synergy, but it is still here. It's kind of difficult to look at a commander that says you can kind of just kill all of your opponent's creatures whenever you want and not put in the cards that allow you to do that. So we have cards like Knight of Souls Betrayal, which is 2 black for a legendary enchantment that simply says all creatures get -1/-1. So yeah, this turns our Maha from a 6/5 into a 5/4, but when all of our opponent's creatures have base toughness of 1, this simply means that any creatures our opponents play immediately die because their toughness is base set to 1 and they're getting -1/-1. So unless our opponents have a way to kill Maha, which would involve discarding a card, or through a board wipe, or maybe even a creature that has an enter the battlefield effect, but they don't mind it dying, that is all something they can do. In this case, though, it's not exactly something that you can really play around. There's not a ton of strategies that don't want at least some creatures in play, or maybe even just their commander. So being able to shut our opponents off of playing any creatures is usually an easy way to victory. And then, last but not least, we get our third theme for the deck, and you may have noticed there's a lot of black mana symbols in our casting costs, so our final theme is going to be Devotion. And What better to represent devotion than everybody's favorite Gray Merchant of Asphodel, which is 3 black black for a 2/4 zombie. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. There are a lot of mono black enchantments that we want in this deck, and a lot of creatures that have multiple black pips in their casting cost. Grief, for example, has 2, Knight of Souls Betrayal has 2, Grey Merchant has 2, Maha has 2. So being able to stack up all of those black mana symbols means that we can take a large advantage from things like Grey Merchant to drain out the rest of the table, get in some final hits with our elementals, and if our opponents don't have any creatures to stop us, we can just kind of slowly roll over and win the game. And that's not exactly the main goal here, but what we really want to be doing is beating people down with elementals and using our devotion and -1 synergies to kind of help push us ahead of the rest of the table. So with that being said, let's move on in our deck tech and take a look at some key cards. These are cards that synergize really well with what we're trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions or maybe just value engines all on their own. So the first key card that I want to highlight is going to be Massacre Girl Known Killer. This card is probably the best card advantage engine in the entire deck, because if we're not careful, there is a solid chance we can draw way too many cards with this and kind of put ourselves at a disadvantage, which sounds a little crazy, but it really does draw that many cards. So, Massacre Girl is 2 black black for a 4/4 legendary creature human assassin. She has Menace. Creatures you control have Wither, which means they deal damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. So what that means for us is if we have Maha in play, and our opponents have, say, 5 creatures, and we play anything that gives creatures -1/-1, all 5 of our opponent's creatures are going to die. They're all going to have a toughness of 0 when they die, so Massacre Girl draws us 5 cards, because every single creature that dies will trigger Massacre Girl, even if they all die at the same time. So there is a solid chance that we can play Massacre Girl, immediately wipe the board, and draw 5, 10, maybe even upwards of 15 to 20 cards, depending on how many creatures are in play. And especially if there's someone playing tokens at the table, we can probably draw most of our entire deck. Moving on, though, from our probably best card draw engine, we come to Blowfly Infestation, which is kind of a synergistic piece with Massacre Girl, but in some cases is just kind of a board wipe on its own, which is kind of wild for a 3-mana enchantment. But what it says is it's 2 and a black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, if it had a -1/-1 counter on it, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. So that doesn't seem initially that great when you consider that we don't have a ton of -1/-1 counter synergies. But when you go to look at all of the elementals in mono black, there's actually quite a few of them that either have Wither or that care about giving -1/-1 counters. Even Massacre Girl gives all of our creatures Wither. All we have to do, if we have Maha in play, is put a single -1/-1 counter on any creature. It'll die because it had 1 toughness, and then because it died with a -1/-1 counter on it, we can then put a -1/-1 counter on another creature, which will then die because of Maha, and we can actually just run through all of our opponent's creatures. And yes, it's not a May effect, so if we do kill our opponent's final creature, we will have to put a -1/-1 counter on one of our creatures. That is a worthwhile price to pay when you consider that that was a one-sided board wipe that didn't actually hurt us. Well, I was going to say at all, but I guess we have -1/-1 on one of our creatures, but it's really not that relevant. Moving on, though, we get to our final key card, which is Black Sun's Zenith. And this is a card that I think my price memory has this card being like $5 in my mind. For some reason, when I put this into the deck, I was like, oh, there's no way we're going to be able to play this. It's way too expensive. And I'm not 100% sure why I thought that, but it's only 47 cents for one of the best black board wipes that exists, especially for our deck. Because again, we're talking about giving things just -1/-1. So if Maha's in play, this is a 3-mana, one-sided board wipe that, yes, permanently makes all of our creatures smaller, but again, a small price to pay for a board wipe that can decimate everything our opponents are trying to do. Because Black Sun Zenith is just X black black for a sorcery that says put X -1/-1 counters on each creature, then shuffle Black Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So definitely one of the most powerful board wipe effects, and it's rare that we talk about a board wipe in the key card section. It's happened before, but not very often. But Black Sun Zenith really does deserve that kind of MVP slot that we would use for the key cards. Anyway, though, we're going to move on to the next part of this deck tech, which is going to be cool interactions. And this is the point of the deck tech where I want to highlight a couple of cards that work well together, and in some cases can be value engines, win conditions, or sometimes just a pair of cool cards that I think deserve a little bit of love. So the first pair of cards I want to talk about is going to be between Shriekmaw and Patriarch's Bidding. And I will say Shriekmaw is kind of a stand-in here, but it's a stand-in for every elemental that has Evoke, which we mentioned earlier with Grief. Because Shriekmaw is 4 and a black for a 3/2 elemental, it has Fear, and when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature, and it evokes for 1 and a black. So if we play 1 and a black, then we play the creature, it dies, and we destroy a non-artifact, non-black creature. So we want to compare that alongside all of our other evoke creatures and use it with Patriarch's Bidding, which is 3 black black for a sorcery. Each player chooses a creature type, and each player returns all creature cards of a type chosen this way from their graveyard to the battlefield. I'm sure this is surprising no one, but we will in fact be choosing Elemental, because now all of our evoke creatures, we've gotten their abilities once. They've died, they've gone to the graveyard, we can now reanimate them with Patriarch's Bidding, get their enter the battlefield effects again, and then also keep the creatures around this time because they weren't evoked. And yes, there is a chance that Patriarch's Bidding backfires a little bit if there are other Kindred decks at the table, but it's not likely to be relevant when a lot of our enter the battlefield effects do damage, destroy creatures, make people discard. There's a good chance we can kind of claw our way back from that, even if there's, say, a Dragons or Elves player at the table. But that is only cool interaction number 1, so of course we got to move on to cool interaction number 2, which is going to be between Nest of Scarabs and Soul Snuffers. So Nest of Scarabs, again, one of the better cards in this deck. I really had a tough time choosing the key cards for this deck because they're all just so powerful and so synergistic. But it's 2 and a black for an enchantment. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. The main reason I want to talk about that is because of Soul Snuffers, because that is 2 black black for a 3/3 elemental shaman. When it comes into play, put a -1/-1 counter on each creature. So just like we talked about earlier with Massacre Girl drawing cards, this is going to be the same thing, but instead of cards, it's creatures. So if our opponents have 5 creatures, and this also does count itself, Soul Snuffers will put counters on our own things, but we just play Soul Snuffers, our opponents have 5 creatures, that means there are 6 creatures that get -1/-1 counters, that means we get 6 1/1 insect creature tokens. Again, most likely what this is going to do is wipe the board for us. It's going to get rid of all of our opponent's things because of Maha, and we get to build a massive army of creatures that can then just kind of close out the game because now our opponents don't have anything to block with. So while this can be a little bit rough on creature decks, I do think it's worth mentioning because they're both incredibly cheap pieces and they play a very important role in the deck. Anyway, With that all out of the way, we're going to move on to the budget portion of this deck. And this week, our deck came in at $96.49, which is just below our $100 budget limit. And the most expensive card in the entire deck was Dread, which is 3 black, black, black for a 6/6 elemental incarnation. It has Fear. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, destroy it. And when Dread is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. And it is a whopping $6.09, which is a little unfortunate. But you may have noticed as we were going through this deck tech, there's not a ton of super expensive cards. There are, however, a handful of cards that float between $4 and $6 because a lot of the mono black elementals come from Lorwyn and Shadowmoor and have never really been reprinted, meaning that there's just not a ton of them out there, so they're just kind of a little more expensive than you might expect. I will say, I think that this deck goes down drastically in price if and when we ever see a Lorwyn remastered set, but seeing as that's not something that's ever been announced, I wouldn't exactly bank on it, but it would be pretty cool. Anyway, I do think Dread is worth including in the deck because it's a great way to prevent your opponents from attacking you. Plus, it's just a 6/6 with Fear, which is pretty good all on its own, especially, once again, if our opponents have no creatures. So I do think it's worth including if you're able to do so. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to include in the deck that's a little outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And this card is one that I had in the deck until the very end, and I was trying so hard to get the budget to a point where I could include it, and I just wasn't able to do it. And that card is Necroskitter at a massive $14. Because Necroskitter is 1 black black for a 1/4 elemental, it has Wither, and whenever a creature an opponent controls with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you may return that card to the battlefield under your control. There is a very good chance that because we can one-sided board wipe so frequently using -1/-1 counters, this kind of turns into a mono-black insurrection. And not insurrection in the sense that we're going to cast it and immediately win because our stuff isn't going to have haste, but it means that we get to permanently steal every creature on our opponent's board if we have Maha, Black Sun Zenith, and Necroskitter. So this is definitely a card that I think makes the deck significantly more powerful, but it is also very expensive. However, if you don't mind that, you can put it into the deck, and if you're putting it in, you would have to take a card out. The card I would recommend taking out is Crippling Fear, which is 2 black black for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Creatures that aren't of the chosen type get -3/-3 until the end of turn. While I do think Crippling Fear is a pretty good card in Kindred decks, I actually don't think that this is the deck for it. Because we're already giving our opponent's creatures so many kind of debuffs almost in video game terms to their toughness, we're looking at creatures that are going to be dying pretty regularly, and that -3/-3 is, in most cases, not actually going to be better than just a -1/-1, but it's a sorcery for 4 mana when most of our other -1/-1 effects are either permanent for 4 mana or can be instant speed for 2 or 3. So I don't think that that is really where we want to be. I think it's just a little bit above rate for what we want to be spending. That being said, it is still a good card because obviously it's still just a one-sided board wipe, but I think Necroskitter would probably do better in that slot. Now, with all of that being said, we've come to the end of our deck tech, and before we get into a game with this deck, because obviously we got to get in a game, we got to see how this thing performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, we are on a ton of different social media websites. You can find us over there. I try to post kind of sneak peeks of the deck techs or maybe just some random magic ideas that are on my mind. I also make sure to post all of the links to the videos, so if you ever miss them, you can check us out there. And if you would like to support us a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon and right here on YouTube as a channel member. Doing either of those two things gets you access to things like the guarantee from me that any of your cards that you suggest will be turned into games eventually, the guarantee that you will get the deck lists a week early, you get to join a Discord channel where we kind of brew up a lot of the decks and also play some of the games. So if you want to be in the games on the channel, that is the best way to do it. And I've mentioned this before, but I do want to specify for anyone who may have missed it, if you are interested in joining the Discord, but you don't want to stick around on the Patreon for an extended period of time, that is perfectly fine. You are more than welcome to jump in at that $5 level, join the Discord, and then you can drop the Patreon if you need to. It's not a requirement. It's just a requirement to get you in the door. You don't need to keep it if you want to stay. I don't want to gatekeep people that way. So if that's something you're interested in, please do check it out. Otherwise, I do want to give a quick shout out to all of our patrons and channel members. So a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Whack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, and Galen. So thank you all so much for all of your support in 2024, and I hope to continue to be worth that support in 2025. Now, one last thing before we jump into the game, and that is, of course, please do check out Shipping Shield. We are currently affiliated with Shipping Shield, so if you're looking to get a discount on some of their products, which are amazing by the way, then you can use our discount code, which is on the screen and also in the description of the video, as well as a bunch of codes for different quantities as well. So Shipping Shield, phenomenal, really happy to be affiliated with them, and please do check them out. But with all of that being said, let's check out our opponents for this week and see what our Mahalementals can do in a game. So first up, we of course got to highlight our 3 opponents this week. We have Vintage bringing back Archelos, Lagoon Mystic. We have Jason playing Azuri, Stalker of Spheres. And we have Bilal playing Olivia, Opulent Outlaw. So we have seen Vintage's Archelos deck before. This is kind of a tapping, untapping style deck. He really wants to try to tap his opponent's creatures down and then keep them tapped for as long as possible. So that way he can play his own creatures and just kind of get in for damage, or maybe convince his opponents to take out his other opponents. But it's a very sweet deck and he's put a lot of time and effort into it. So I'm very excited to see it come back. Next up, we have Jason playing Azuri. This is a Simic Proliferate deck, so +1/+1 counters, I'm sure. This is right up Jason's alley, one of his favorite archetypes, and definitely one that he's very good with. So I would not be surprised as the game goes on for him to just have some giant creatures and draw a ton of cards with his proliferation. And I will say, I think that this is probably the deck at the table that's going to give us the most problems. Because even though Maha may set a base toughness to 1, they can't stop +1/+1 counters. So if our opponents get a ton of +1/+1 counters, then Maha still isn't going to be doing too much. And that is my biggest concern with this Azuri deck, is it'll get its creatures out of our control, and there's nothing we're going to be able to do about it. That same problem actually holds true for the Olivia deck that's being played by Bilal, and while I think that this one's going to be less of a problem because I don't think the +1/+1 counters are the main synergy here, I think he's more focused on outlaws, which would be assassins, mercenaries, pirates, rogues, and warlocks. He does still have the ability to put +1/+1 counters on his creatures, meaning that there is a solid chance that his creatures also get out of our reach. So that is definitely something we have to try to maintain control of in the early game. Hopefully drop Maha early, get something that gives -1/-1 into play as quickly as possible, and kind of lock our opponents out from getting all of those +1/+1 counters. So with that being said though, let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner this week. Make sure you get those predictions in. As always, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and then let's get into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Vintage goes first, followed by Jason, myself, and then Bilal. On Vintage's first turn, he plays a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1. Jason also plays a Temple of Mystery, scrying 1. I play a Swamp and cast Changeling Outcast, which can't block or be blocked. Bilal plays a Path of Ancestry. Vintage plays a Temple of Malady, scrying 1, then cast Ponder, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order, then drawing a card. Jason plays a Forest and cast Cankerbloom, which can be sacrificed to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or proliferate. I play a swamp and attack Bilal for 1, then, in my second main phase, I cast Swift Foot Boots. Bilal plays a swamp, then cast Boros Signet. Vintage plays a Thornwood Falls, gaining a life, then cast Termination Facilitator, which can tap to put a bounty counter on a creature or planeswalker, also destroying anything with a bounty counter when it's dealt damage. Jason attacks me for 3 with the Cankerbloom, then in his second main phase plays an island and cast Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. I play a swamp, then attack Jason for 1, and in my second main phase I suspend Festering March with 3 time counters. Bilal plays a Plains and casts his commander Olivia Opulent Outlaw, making a treasure token whenever 1 or more outlaws he controls deals combat damage to a player, and also letting him pay 3 to sacrifice 2 treasures and put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature he controls. Vintage cast a Mire in Misery, making each opponent sacrifice a creature or enchantment, killing Cankerbloom, Changeling Outcast, and Olivia. After that resolves, he attacks Jason for 1. Jason casts a Simic Ascendancy, putting a growth counter on it whenever a creature he controls has a +1/+1 counter put on it, and winning the game in his upkeep if the Ascendancy has 20 or more counters. Then he plays a Simic Growth Chamber, returning an island to his hand. In my upkeep, I remove a time counter from Festering March, play a Baron Moor, and cast Commander Sphere. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Council's Judgment, making each player vote for a permanent that Bilal doesn't control, and exiling each permanent with the most votes. This ends with Bilal and Cole voting for Simic Ascendancy, while Jason and I both vote for Termination Facilitator, exiling both of them. Vintage cast an Academy Lore Master, letting each player draw an additional card in their draw step, but if they do, making their spells cost 2 additional mana that turn. On Jason's turn, he draws 2, making his spells cost 2 more this turn, then plays an island and passes. On my turn, I draw 2 cards, making my spells cost 2 more, and I also remove a time counter from Festering March, then pass. On Bilal's turn, he draws 2, making his spells cost 2 more, and casts Nighthawk Scavenger, which has power equal to 1 plus the number of card types in his opponent's graveyards. Vintage cast a Black Market Connections, then attacks Jason for 2. Jason plays a Forest, then casts Inexorable Tide, letting him proliferate whenever he casts a spell. In my upkeep, I remove the final counter from Festering March, casting it for free, giving all my opponent's creatures -1/-1 until the end of turn, then resuspending it with 3 more time counters. After that, I play a Swamp, and cast my commander Maha Its Feathers Knight, making all of my opponent's creatures have a base toughness of 1, which, thanks to Festering March, immediately kills all of my opponent's creatures. Finally, I equip Maha with Swiftfoot Boots, giving it hexproof and haste so that I can attack Jason for 6. Bilal plays a Dragon Skull Summit and casts Powder Ganger, paying for its squad ability twice, creating 2 token copies of it when it enters. Then each one destroys an artifact, destroying my Swiftfoot Boots and Commander Sphere, but I sacrifice the sphere before the ability resolves to draw a card. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, drawing a card and making a treasure token, then plays a Jungle Hollow, gaining a life, and finally he casts Dungeon Geists, tapping my Maha and preventing it from untapping for as long as the Geists are in play. Jason plays an island and casts Kami of Whispered Hopes, putting an additional +1/+1 counter on his permanents whenever he would put a counter on them. Then it can also tap for mana equal to the counters on the Kami. After that, he cast Fangs of Colonia, putting a +1/+1 counter on the Kami, then doubling the number of counters on it. Once that's resolved, he cast Tezzeret's Gambit, drawing 2 cards and proliferating twice. In my upkeep, I remove a counter from Festering March, then cast Harvester of Souls, letting me draw a card whenever a non-token creature dies. Bilal plays a command beacon and recasts his commander Olivia, and then also casts Lightning Greaves, immediately equipping them to Olivia to give her haste and shroud. This lets him attack Vintage and Jason both for 2 with a Powder Ganger token, and attack me for 3 with Olivia. Jason blocks and kills the Powder Ganger attacking him, while Vintage takes 2, I take 3, Bilal gains 3, and he also makes 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Bilal sacrifices 2 treasures with Olivia to put 2 +1/+1 counters on each of his creatures, which unfortunately he couldn't have done since he didn't have the 3 mana he needed, but we don't catch that at the time. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, making a treasure and drawing a card, then plays an Emergence Zone and casts Sleep of the Dead, tapping Jason's Kami and preventing it from untapping in its controller's next untap step. After that, he cast Illithid Harvester, turning Jason's Kami and my Maha face down into 2/2 horror creatures since they're tapped. Finally, he moves to combat and attacks Jason for 3 with the Dungeon Geists. Jason plays a forest and casts Ever-Flowing Chalice, kicked once so that it enters with 1 charge counter and taps for 1 mana, also proliferating. After that, he cast his commander Izuri, Stalker of Spheres, proliferating on the cast, then paying 3 mana when he enters to proliferate 2 more times, now drawing a card whenever he proliferates. Thanks to his commander, he draws 2 cards now. In my upkeep, I remove another counter from Festering March, then cast Solemn Simulacrum, searching my library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. On Bilal's turn, he cast Angrath's Marauders, doubling the damage that would be dealt by permanents he controls. Then he attacks me for 10 with Olivia, and attacks Vintage for 10 with a Powder Ganger, but Vintage blocks with Illithid Harvester, killing it, letting me draw a card, and I take 10 while Bilal gains 10 and makes a treasure. Then in his second main phase, Bilal casts Zulaport Cutthroat, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a creature he controls dies. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life for Black Market Connections, making a treasure and drawing a card, then plays Hall of the Storm Giants, and casts his own Maha, its Feathers Knight, giving all his opponent's creatures a base toughness of 1. Jason plays a forest and casts Park Heights Maverick, proliferating on cast, drawing a card, and then proliferating when it deals combat damage to a player or dies. Once that resolves, he also cast Rustvine Cultivator, proliferating and drawing a card. Then he also cast both Farseek and Nature's Lore, proliferating twice, drawing 2 more cards, and searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. After that, he cast Contagion Engine, proliferating, drawing a card, and putting a -1/-1 counter on each creature that Vintage controls. In my upkeep, I remove the final counter from Festering March, casting it for free, giving all of my opponent's creatures -1/-1 until the end of turn, then resuspending it with 3 time counters. This kills Angrath's Marauders, Rustvine Cultivator, Park Heights Maverick, Izuri, and Zulaport Cutthroat, letting me draw 5, letting Jason proliferate and draw a card, while Bilal gains 2 and makes each of his opponents lose 2. After that, I play a Swamp and cast Fester Creep, entering with a +1/+1 counter, and finally I cast Grey Merchant of Asphodel, making each opponent lose 5 life since my devotion to black is 5, and gaining life equal to the life lost this way, which is 15. On Bilal's turn, he cast Curtain's Call, destroying 2 target creatures, destroying Vintage's Maha and my Harvester of Souls, letting me draw a card. Once that resolves, he attacks me for 9 with Olivia, and attacks Vintage for 8 with a Powder Ganger token. Luckily, Vintage decides to save me from dying to commander damage by casting Fog, preventing all combat damage. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, drawing a card and making a treasure token, then plays a forest, and casts his commander, Archelos Lagoon Mystic, making all permanents enter the battlefield untapped since it's currently untapped. Then he also cast a Patriarch's Seal, which he can pay a mana to activate an untapped target legendary creature. At the end of turn, Jason cast Collective Resistance, destroying Bilal's Lightning Greaves and proliferating. On Jason's turn, he plays a Yavimaya Coast and recasts his commander Izuri, proliferating and paying 3 mana when he enters to proliferate 2 more times, drawing 2 cards, and killing Vintage's Dungeon Geists with -1/-1 counters. After that, he cast a Tainted Observer, proliferating, drawing a card, and now letting him pay 2 mana when a creature enters to proliferate. After that resolves, he cast Curse of the Swine for X=8, proliferating, drawing a card, and exiling each creature his opponents control, replacing them with 2/2 Boar tokens. Once that's resolved, he cast a Cloudfin Raptor, which has Evolve, proliferating and drawing a card, and also casts Sakura Tribe Elder, proliferating, evolving the Cloudfin Raptor, and drawing a card. Finally, he moves to combat and attacks Bilal for 20 with the Horror, but Bilal blocks with a Boar token, taking no damage. In my upkeep, I remove a counter from Festering March and cast Massacre Worm, giving all my opponent's creatures -2/-2, making an opponent lose 2 life whenever one of their creatures dies. In response, Jason sacrifices Sakura Tribe Elder, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Then all the Boars and Cloudfin Raptor die, making Vintage lose 2 life, Jason lose 2 life, and Bilal lose 4 life. Once that's resolved, I attack Jason for 8 with my Boar tokens, and in my second main phase, I play a Swamp and cast Cower in Fear, giving my opponent's creatures another -1/-1 until the end of turn, killing Izuri and Tainted Observer, making Jason lose 4 more life. On Bilal's turn, he cast Back in Town for X=4, returning 4 outlaws from his graveyard to the battlefield. This lets him get back Nighthawk Scavenger, Angrath's Marauders, Zulaport Cutthroat, and Pitiless Plunderer. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, making a treasure and drawing a card, then plays an island and casts Sleep, tapping all of Bilal's creatures and preventing them from untapping in his next untap step. Then, once that resolves, he recasts his commander, Archelos. Jason plays an Alchemist Refuge and attacks Bilal for 20 with the Horror creature. In his second main phase, Jason recasts his commander Izuri, proliferating, and then also casts Renegade Crassus, which has Evolve and puts a +1/+1 counter on each other creature he controls with a +1/+1 counter on it whenever it evolves. This also lets him proliferate and draw a card. Once all of that has resolved, he casts Experiment 1, proliferating and drawing another card, then activates the Contagion Engine, proliferating twice, drawing 2 more cards, and finally casts a Simic Signet, proliferating and drawing yet another card. In my upkeep, I remove a counter from Festering March, then attack Bilal for 14 with my entire board, putting him to only 3 life. In my second main phase, I recast my commander Maha, but Jason has an answer, countering it with Fuel for the Cause, proliferating twice and drawing 2 cards. After that, I play a Guildless Commons, returning a swamp to my hand, and finally, I cast Knight of Souls Betrayal, giving all creatures -1/-1, killing Experiment 1 and Zulaport Cutthroat, making Jason lose 2 life. Then Bilal gains a life and makes each of his opponents lose a life. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Drossfire Bridge and simply recasts his commander Olivia, then passes. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, making a treasure and drawing a card, then activates Hall of the Storm Giants, turning it into a 7/7 creature, letting him attack me for 7 with both it and Archelos. On Jason's turn, he activates Contagion Engine, proliferating twice and drawing 2 cards, then casts Sword of Truth and Justice, proliferating, drawing a card, and immediately equipping it to his horror creature, giving it +2/+2, protection from blue and white, and letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature he controls and proliferate whenever it deals combat damage to a player. After that, he casts Roalesque Apex Hybrid, proliferating, drawing a card, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on the horror, which he couldn't have done since it had protection from blue, but this lets him attack me for 38 damage with the horror, knocking me out of the game, and he also attacks Bilal for 8 with Azuri and the Crassus, but Bilal blocks the Crassus with Olivia, killing both creatures, gaining 4 life, taking 4 damage, and remaining at 2. Since the horror dealt damage, Jason also gets to put a +1/+1 counter on Azuri, proliferate, and draw a card. Then in his second main phase, Jason casts Basking Root Scale, which has Adapt, and makes an Eldrazi spawn token whenever a counter is put on it. He also proliferates and draws another card. Bilal plays a Plains and attacks Jason for 2 with the Pitiless Plunderer, and attacks Vintage for 20 with his other 2 creatures. However, before attacks are actually declared, Vintage casts Take into Custody, tapping the Nighthawk Scavenger and preventing it from untapping on Bilal's next untap step. This means that Bilal attacks Vintage for only 8 with the Marauders, and attacks Jason for 2 with the Plunderer. In an attempt to save himself, Jason casts Heroic Intervention, giving all his permanents hexproof and indestructible, but more importantly, letting him proliferate and draw a card. Unfortunately, he can't find an answer, so he takes 2 damage and is knocked out of the game. In Vintage's upkeep, he pays 3 life to Black Market Connections, making a treasure token and drawing a card, then plays a Woodland Cemetery and casts Tiny Bones Bauble Burglar, as well as casting Alluring Siren, before moving to combat, attacking Bilal for 2 with Archelos, knocking him out, and winning Vintage the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Everyone's deck looked very impressive in that game. It was kind of cool to see Jason just get a ton of counters, do a ton of proliferating, and the fact that he knocked us out of the game with a horror creature that was technically a face-down commie was very impressive. It meant that he didn't really need a lot of the abilities of his creatures, he just needed the counters and the proliferation. And I think that this is one of those games that just really goes to prove how powerful Inexorable Tide is, because that thing proliferating on every single spell is just an absolute engine that pushes Jason's deck to another level. He unfortunately did not quite get there in the end. Bilal also struggling a bit throughout the course of the game, getting his board wiped multiple times. But I think the ability to reanimate his creatures and also put +1/+1 counters on them, do a ton of damage, kind of get some hasty attacks. It was very impressive to see what he could do with the Outlaw archetype. It's not one that I've personally played against very often, so I thought it was super cool to see the mix of creatures he was able to play and still tie them all together synergistically. Let's see, let's talk about Vintage next. I think we'll leave our deck for last. That's kind of the fun piece of it. Vintage, his deck was also very impressive throughout the game. I'm glad to see that Archelos did a little bit more than it did last time, because it kind of just got run over last time. But I think that the ability to tap his opponent's creatures and then keep them tapped down was a little bit undervalued when we went into this game. I didn't expect it to play a big role, but Archelos actually coming in, attacking at one point, and then forcing everything to come into play tapped, actually wound up winning Vintage the game, because it meant that Jason and Bilal couldn't put blockers into play to prevent him from attacking them or to prevent someone else from attacking them, meaning that he could kind of just clean up, which I feel like was kind of the goal of the Archelos deck in general. It played a little bit like a control deck, which is not a common theme for Sultai decks, but it was very, very cool to see. And then, of course, Last but not least, we have our Maha deck. The deck felt very strong. There were a couple of points throughout the game where I felt like I needed to apologize to my opponents because it just kept wiping the board and kept giving everything -1/-1. And having Festering March just constantly repeating really made the game feel like it was a race. Like people had to get out ahead of Maha, otherwise it was just going to take control, wipe everybody's boards, and just beat people down until we won. And admittedly, we did not wind up winning. I think that we were in a position where we probably could have if I had left back just a single blocker to prevent Jason from taking us out with the Kami, but it wasn't quite to be, and that's okay. I still think the deck was very powerful even though it didn't get a win, and I had a ton of fun playing it. It is worth mentioning, if you do decide to pick this deck up though, it can be a little bit oppressive against some creature-based decks, so that is something to be aware of if that is your meta or your archetype. So, with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please do put them in the comments. As always, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.